to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron is up this week.
Yeah.
What are you bringing to the table today?
Well, today, after our little break,
Yes.
I am bringing a book called Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal by Mohammed El-Kurd. And this book is really about flipping the narratives about Palestinians and all of those sort of dominant stories that we have and we hear, flipping them on their head. And it's pulling at the roots of how settler colonialism tells stories about the people and the land that it is colonizing. I think it's a book that tells us that the stories that are told about Palestinians are almost entirely incomplete.
Yeah.
We don't hear those full stories.
Yes.
And as Muhammad says in the author's notes at the opening of the book, quote, "Criticism is good. By this, I do not mean self-flagellation or victim blaming. Good faith criticism should be engaged with in good faith. However, I do not consider perfect victims to be a critique per se, nor is it a manifesto or a monograph. Rather, it is an interrogation of strategies and tactics, ideologies and impulses, and hypotheses and beliefs, an infiltration of the dominant discourses." Which is such a perfect way to say it.
It really is.
But this book, for me, shook loose some of those dominant narratives that I have been holding on to, and not even holding on to, but they've just been present, that I haven't always noticed. And it held a spotlight on the ways that the discourse is shaped by the empires of the day. And this is ultimately a book, I think, that asks, why is this what we accept? Even when we don't accept it, some of the ways that we refuse reinforces the assumptions of the dominant narratives. We appeal to the humanity of certain people over others. We accept, as Muhammad describes it, the dichotomy of victim and terrorist.
Yes.
And we can subconsciously accept those narratives, those stories, that dichotomy, even when we're trying to criticize the genocide or the actions of the IOF.
Yes.
And there's a lot in this book,
Yes.
There's a lot in this book. And we could probably make an episode about each chapter.
Yeah.
I think I went through and looked at all of the notes that I pulled from reading the book.
Yeah.
And I have enough for at least 3 episodes
Just
from those.
Yeah.
And so, I think we could probably, if we said we're going to spend 9 weeks, there's 9 chapters in this book. We're going to spend 9 weeks on this book. I think we could make really solid episodes about each one of these chapters.
Make it a whole curriculum there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just go deep. But we're not going to do that today. But let's get started.
Yeah.
Where do you want to start?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that this was an incredible book. It was a moving book. And I really appreciated Muhammad's analysis of the concepts of humanity and dignity and Zionism and violence and, of course, perfect victimhood in the context of Palestine and the Palestinian people. And there was just so much brilliance in this book, and it was a really great read. I finished it just a few days ago, and so it's so present in my mind. I'm so excited to talk about this one. One of the things that I was struck by early on in the book was Muhammad's analysis around the cost of Palestinian life. And so he talks about a little bit about this in chapter 1. He says, quote, "Zionism is the leading cause of death in occupied Palestine through both direct state-sanctioned violence and indirect consequential violence, which trickles down through suffocating bureaucracies, inescapable psychological onslaughts, and impetuous intercommunal conflicts. Yet this man-made quietus is treated like any other leading cause of death, heart disease in the U.S., dementia in England, and is scarcely cause for concern, let alone condemnation." And then a little later on, he says, quote, "Our blood is the price of the colony's sense of security. The empire cuts the lives of our loved ones short to prolong its reign. And our grief is negligible, our rage unwarranted. The more our loved ones are killed by Zionist colonialism, the less space we are offered to grieve them. We cannot narrate this colossal theft of life, let alone avenge it." Yeah, it's deep. For me, like this was certainly the beginnings of the foundation of his analysis around perfect victimhood. And he talks more about that in later chapters in this book, and how the violence that Palestinians experience has to be huge, has to be spectacular, or deceased people have to be martyrs or have to be the perfect victims in order for them to truly matter. But for me, it also just hammered home the blatant disregard for and the scale of the loss of Palestinian life that we have experienced in our recent history, but also throughout time, and just how unconscionable and wrong that is, and how much it needs to stop. In so many passages in this book, it just felt so heavy and real, and he did such a brilliant job sort of bringing that to light, and as you said, shining a light on it. And for me, it's just reinforced why this genocide, why the ways in which we consciously and unconsciously think about, and talk about Palestinian people, like how all of that just needs to change.
Yeah, I really appreciate the end of that first quote you had, where he talks about, the second quote you had.
The second part, yeah.
Where he talks about, we can't narrate this colossal theft of life, let alone avenge it. There's not space, there's not a platform offered in this mainstream, quote unquote, media for the narration of that theft of life, let alone the ability to say, I'm going to resist what's happening to me, what's happening to my people, what's happening to my family. That's not that. If I can't tell the story, there's no way that you can do that. And I think he makes that point a lot in this book.
Yes.
And it's very poignant, moving,
well done,
tragic.
Yes.
All the things. And so, sort of moving into I think a little bit of that concept of not having the ability to narrate that loss, that theft of life. In chapter 2, which is called The Politics of Defanging, Mohammed talks about how we talk about Palestinians and the way that the media tries to appeal to our humanity through the ways that Palestinians are dehumanized, both by occupation and by the narratives employed about them or against them. And so he says, quote, "It is the ceaseless infantilization of the dehumanized subject. For the spectators to sympathize with the other, they must first sanitize and subdue him, sever him from his origin story, rendering him utterly displaced and effaced. We sanctify our victims in our testimonials and eulogies, adorning them with commiserating anecdotes. We hamper them with innocence. And we do this not only in the Palestinian context, but also with regard to Black American victims of police brutality. They were artists, or they were mentally ill, or they were unarmed. It is as if condemning the state for sanctioning the death of a Black person is permissible only if the slain person is a sterile model of American citizenry. One could say the same about sexual assault victims. We must notify the listener that the victim was sober and dressed appropriately. And more, we promise those spectating that if they deign to come face to face with the dehumanized, they would see their own reflection in our benign, haggard eyes." So super powerful there. So much in that. And we see how the narratives are supposed to operate. Look into the pain of these people. Look at the way that they're treated. Isn't it unfair? But it's selective.
Yes.
It's so selective. And it's the ones who get to be, as Mohammed points out, models of citizenry or models of innocence. And he goes on to talk about how this works in favor of settler colonization.
Right.
He says, quote, "Humanization diverts critical scrutiny away from the colonizer and onto the colonized, obscuring the inherent injustice of colonialism, thus shielding the colonial project. In misplacing their focus, advocates or lawyers or journalists, etc., insinuate that the oppressed must demonstrate their worthiness of liberty and dignity first and foremost. Otherwise, occupation, subjugation, police brutality, dispossession, surveillance, and extrajudicial executions would be excusable or even necessary."
Wow.
Yeah. So we see that operate in the way that we talk about individual victims of occupation. It's that shift to the individual as we talk about violence that obscures the machinations of the empire or the colonizers, that created that violence.
Right.
So we focus so much on that individual person, we don't see the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a story about, isn't this sad that this person was killed, rather than, isn't it infuriating that this empire we live in kills people like this and thousands of other people we will never hear about.
That part.
All of the time.
Yes.
Extrajudicially and judicially.
Yep.
And many times that rule of law is arbitrary.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that part for me, and the thousands others like them. I mean, I think what you're talking about there is so important, and such a great analysis of what Mohammed is talking about, this idea of it's individuals, but we have to take a step back and also see that it is all of us. It absolutely impacts all of us. And there was so much in chapter 2. Like, I feel like I spent a lot of time with chapter 2. It was incredible. And part of that was because there was this moving set of questions that he poses in this book, which is at the end of chapter 2. And I wanted to talk about them because I thought that they were incredible. He closes chapter 2 by saying, quote, "What promises to save you from dehumanization? Sophisticated degrees, the money in your bank account, the willingness to forgive, an unassuming gaze and unthreatening demeanor, connections to the magazine editor who slanders your neighbor. At the bar, he asks his friend in the military to release you from the cell as a favor to go easy on you. You are worldly and politically correct. You are a prodigy, unlike the others. But what about the others? The others who suffocate under this shrinking definition of humanity, those who are not privileged enough to go to a 5-star university or be born into a line of feudal lords. What about those without halos, the angry men who wander the streets with mouths full of spit and venom, the children whose shoulders are burdened by the straps of rifles, the women who choose an explosive path? What about the poor? What about those who are cruel with the occupier and cruel with their kin, the not-so-gentle fathers, the reckless in our midst, those who would furrow the eyebrows of Europeans, the sister who found her rage in the kitchen drawer, and the sister learning the anatomy of the gun? Do they not deserve life? According to whose law?" And I sat with that for a while. I mean, it's just a brilliant line of questions, and obviously huge in the context of Palestinian life and what Palestinians have experienced. And so, I certainly want to name that and honor that for sure. But, it also made me think about what you were talking about there. And it made me think about all of us, especially in the context of our current administration and its decisions and its executive orders around all of the things: citizenship, human rights, women's rights, healthcare, the list goes on and on. To me, their actions have proven that none of us are safe. And so Mohammed's questions there of who will save us from dehumanization and who deserves life are huge questions that all of us need to be thinking about and ask ourselves and ask of our administration and hold our administration to the fire about, certainly before it's too late, if it's not already too late. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that those questions are stop you in your tracks.
Yes, it really did.
Because they just make you think about, okay, yeah, what about this person? What about that person?
Right.
Yeah, this book is so good.
It's so good.
It's so powerful and moving. So one of the other pieces of the dominant narratives that Mohammed unpacks in this book is about resistance and the different ways that we talk about it and the assumptions made about it. And so, as I mentioned earlier, he talks about the dichotomy of victim versus terrorist. And at one point, he mentions that those who are labeled terrorists are never heard from. It's a way to dismiss their perspective or their experiences. And that's sort of named in those questions that you just asked.
Right.
Like, are the people who turn toward these other choices not worthy of life? And according to whose law? And I think that we see how that works here. And so he says in chapter 3, which is called Shireen's Passport, that, quote, "The militant, whether in Gaza or Jenin, is not an inexplicable phenomenon or a freak of nature, nor is he just a descendant of Nakba survivors who were forced from their homes in Jaffa and Al-Nakab, carrying their bitter anger decades after it had gone stale. The militant confronts his own Nakbas every day. His fury is resuscitated each time he is strip-searched on the streets of Jerusalem or beaten with rifle butts at the Kalandiah military checkpoint. Each displacement, each demolition, each premature funeral adds fuel to his fire. Each sibling he buries or visits in prison, each bullet that ambushes his colleagues, each rocket polluting his sky reignites him. And so we see potentially what drives resistance fighters in this paragraph, in this quote. We see the way that the occupation operates with violence. And so it's understandable to me that some people who live within that violence would respond to it with violent resistance.
Right.
Even if that's uncomfortable to me as I sit here in my, relatively cushy U.S. home.
Yeah.
And it also makes me think about the ways that we talk about prison, and that prison is a response to violence typically, but that violence just begets more violence.
Absolutely.
In
that
system.
Yes.
It regenerates, it reifies and reaffirms it. And we talk about Gaza being an open air prison. And so we see that it's a pattern. It's a cycle that continues. And so I think that's something that just occurred to me that, well, yeah, you would turn to, if all you see and all you know is violence, you might turn that way.
It's in the
because
air.
What if that's all you know?
Absolutely.
What else is there? And so Mohammed then goes on to say, quote, resistance in the Western mind is a mutating concept. While Ukrainian resistance is glorified for its guerrilla warfare tactics, Palestinian resistance, termed terrorism, is puzzling, perverted, and pathological. Mainstream media's insistence on these framings is not due to any fundamental differences in the way both peoples exercise violence, nor is it solely because of Ukrainian skin color. One needs look no further than the Irish Republican Army to see that whiteness alone is no golden ticket, at least not in a war against British colonialism.
Yes.
So we know that the resistance of some is labeled freedom fighting, and the resistance of others is labeled terrorism.
Right.
And we can see in this example, I think, the way that narrative is spun over time. And we can see in these examples that if you're fighting in opposition of the dominant empires of the day and their allies, then you're a terrorist.
Oh, absolutely.
So we see that with the IRA. We see that with any kind of resistance to Israel and the army there. It's who's telling the story gets to determine who's a terrorist or not. Yep. And so it goes back to that old George W. Bush quote after 9/11, I believe, where he said, "You're either with us or against us." Right. And that, I think that kind of encapsulates for me who gets to be a terrorist and who gets to be a freedom fighter.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I also just really appreciate the analysis there around, violence and that it's in the air, right? And so if that's all you know, then it is understandable that that is a path you might go on without and that analysis and that experience and the way that we talk about it is, so limiting, right? Yeah. And there's more to the story if folks are given an opportunity for more and for better. I love all of that, and so much of that connects to some of the other analysis that Mohammed talks about in this book in later chapters, and a lot of it gave me a lot of big feelings, particularly thinking about the power that the state wields, I should say, and also around what happens when we stand up to the state. So I think you're sort of kind of get to that, starting to talk about that a little bit. And so in chapter 4, which is called A Life in Cross-Examination, one of the things Mohammed says is, quote, our reactions to brutality, whether violent or nonviolent, altruistic or vengeful, will be what gets printed in the newspaper, manufactured to appear as the epicenter of the matter, the headline. Politicians will often frame our response to brutalization, especially if it is militant, as the rationale behind their latest sordid policy, the reason why the earth spins on its axis. That we were brutalized at all is an ancillary factoid, tangential to our conduct and disposition. Consider mainstream media and the so-called international community treating the events of October 7th as though they were the genesis of the conflict. Consider the podiums. Consider the bookshelves. And so again, for me, that made me think about how throughout history, people have stood up against the state. We organize, we mobilize, we campaign, we rally, we fight against and in response to state-sanctioned violence and authoritarianism and capitalism and white supremacy. And we also organize and rally and stand in solidarity with and for each other. And that certainly has been the case with people standing in solidarity with Palestinians, given everything that has been happening. And Mohammed's analysis also made me think about something that we've talked about before, which is how, especially in times of conflict and uprisings, the state wants to keep us in our place. The state wants to uphold the status quo. And that's connected to what you were talking about there. But, for me, for all that, for me, makes me just think about how it's so necessary now more than ever that we continue the work and the fight.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. There's always that turn of, let's normalize, let's get things back to even playing field. And the assumption in that is that normal was okay.
Yes.
As well. And so I think there's a holding on to the status quo of the empire that we're like, well, the status quo wasn't working for us either.
Right.
This is just a flashpoint in what is the status quo, honestly.
Right. And has brought us here to the streets and has brought us here to stand in solidarity with these folks. Yeah. And we won't stand for it anymore. Absolutely.
But this is just this is a flare up of the situation that is still a fire. Absolutely. This is just a particular hot point.
Yes.
So, all right. Well, let's talk about application.
Okay.
This is where we talk about how we can apply what we've learned from this book and our conversation today to our day-to-day lives. I've got a few pieces here, maybe too many pieces.
Okay.
The first is from chapter 4, as you mentioned, is called A Life in Cross-Examination, where Mohammed says, quote, "There are people who have contempt for the world that greets a nurse with her husband's corpse on a stretcher, the world that forces a boy to carry his brother's limbs in a bag. I am one of those people, and I am grateful for my disdain, for it is dignifying. It reminds me that I am human."
Yes.
That closes that chapter, I think, and stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah.
It's getting to me right now. And I think it reminds us to connect to our humanity, to see the ways that the violence of empire operates to subjugate all of us in some way. And then there are the other pieces of application I have are from chapter 8, which is called Are We Indeed All Palestinians? Mohammed says, quote, "Protest movements are generally revered in the past tense once their radical demands become a boring norm." And we see this operate over and over again throughout history.
Yep.
Dr. King is a revered figure in the limited way that he is seen in his legacy. And at the time, you look at the polling, and he was despised by a huge number of people in this country. Then he talks about guilt. He says, quote, "It is tempting, almost comforting, particularly as I look at the food on my table and the roof over my head, to indulge in guilt. But it is an unproductive sentiment. It does not start revolutions. Guilt imposes itself like a nagging cavity. You are acutely aware of its presence, but you continue to shovel the same sweets into your mouth until your teeth rot, until you self-destruct." And I think this is important.
Yes.
We can easily fall into the trap of guilt, which ultimately leads to inaction. He says right there, guilt does not start revolutions.
Right.
But I think there's power in guilt or shame, but you have to digest it into something else. You have to digest it into some form of action. So we can't allow our guilt to let us self-destruct.
Yeah.
It has to be something that drives us to some kind of action, because guilt is, at a basic level, for me, the understanding of how the empire operates and how we aren't targeted by the empire in that particular way.
Ah, yes.
It's when we learn that, say, for example, as a white person, we aren't the targets of white supremacy, but we become the subjects of it in the way that empire has subjects that do its bidding.
Yes.
When we learn that we are U.S. citizens, so we aren't the targets of U.S. imperialism and violence, but we are subjugated by it. We understand the way that the imperial boomerang works, where U.S. empire goes out and tests stuff on other places, other countries, other people, and then brings that surveillance, brings that violence home to us.
Yes.
I think the flip side of guilt is understanding how you're perhaps not the target, but you're the subject of it. You're impacted by it still.
Yes.
And so we have to move from guilt, understand when it's operating, understand what it means for us, and then take it and digest it into something else, into some further analysis, into some further action, because otherwise we can just get stuck there. And we're just stuck in a pit of guilt, like a quicksand trap that we all believe will be a much bigger deal than they actually are.
Absolutely.
But so that's my application. Again, probably too many pieces, probably too many things, and somehow all connected, but I didn't do a great job connecting them all together here in this moment. But I hope our wonderful listeners do that work for me and see how they are all connected, because I believe they are.
I believe they are too. And one of the other things that makes me think about, to save you, if you will, make you feel better. One of the things I love about the work that we do here and the media that we've consumed is these powerful concepts that these folks have talked about. And so guilt is one here. You talked about humanity being one. We've read about solidarity. We have read about humanity. We have read about love. I think about bell hooks and the way in which these concepts are useful in thinking about what we are experiencing through these moments of crisis, through these reckoning moments, through racial justice movements, all the things. And so I absolutely love the analysis here around guilt and the power of guilt and how you cannot sit in that guilt. You have to churn it into action. Turn it into action, as you will. Turn it, whatever you want to do with it, but make it action. I love that. So all that to say, I think that's brilliant application. I'm going to steal a little bit of your application. Okay. My application is, without a doubt, the concept of humanity. All right. I think that's at the core of this book, and it's just a huge takeaway for me from this book. And I think about it from Muhammad's opening paragraphs about how death and genocide are everywhere in Palestine, and it's unfortunately a central part of the Palestinian experience, to how he talks about and shows us how the Palestinian people have been and continue to be dehumanized in every aspect of life and culture and storytelling and the media and society, to the incredibly detrimental effects of colonization and Zionism on Palestinians, and of course through the lens of the concept of perfect victimhood, which is also at the core of this book. One of the passages that really stood out to me about all of this was in the second chapter of the book. So Muhammad says, quote, "The problem is, if you want to humanize the Palestinian, you have to defang the Palestinian. The humanity we have been prescribed by the well-intentioned and the malicious alike, or the humanity we have invented for ourselves, follow as an intricate, dizzying rule book, its commandments written in hieroglyphics. You learn as you fail that it is ineligible, the project of humanization sustained by perpetual victimhood and relegated through ethnocentric parameters for sympathy and solidarity." He then goes on a little later to say, quote, "We are not human automatically by virtue of being human. We are to be humanized by virtue of our proximity to innocence, whiteness, civility, wealth, compromise, collaboration, non-alignment, non-violence, helplessness, futurelessness. This lethal exercise in tightroping is meant to prevent us from falling back into the ring of the condemned." And so with all that said, for me, the humanity of the Palestinian people deserves more than it has been given now and throughout time. And for me, this beautiful book has made that even more clear than it already was.
Yeah. Agreed. Brilliant. All right, well, let's talk about homework. Okay. What are we going to do to continue our learning and unlearning work beyond our conversation today? I want to read Rifka, which is Mohammed El-Kurd's book of poetry from 2021 about his grandmother.
Yes.
And to quote the description page on Haymarket's website, it's about her, quote, exile from Haifa to his family's current dispossession in Sheikh Jarrah, Jerusalem, exposing the cyclical and relentless horror of the Nakba. And I'd also like to read through some of the footnotes in this book for other things to read or watch, because while I did some skimming of those things, I definitely did not look super closely.
Yeah.
And there is a lot in the footnotes that he cites throughout. Even looking at some of the quotes that I pulled today, there's little numbers citing references throughout them. And yeah, so I just want to go back and review some of those things.
I love all of that homework. I'm going to co-sign it. I absolutely want to read that book. I was like, has he written anything else? We've got to read it. And so I'd love to do that. For me, I want to revisit this book. There's so much rich history presented in it that I learned about for the first time. And so part of my homework is just to sit with this book some more and that history, and to do more of a deep dive into all of that, to continue my learning about the history of Palestine and the Palestinian experience. And those footnotes you mentioned would certainly be a part of that homework for sure. I also want to see what other books Haymarket recommends related to this one to just, again, continue my learning work and my understanding of the Palestinian experience. So, yes.
Yeah. One of the other books this makes me think of, as you talk about wanting to continue learning and understanding the Palestinian experience, particularly in the current context, but also in the context of the Nakba, is One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, which is a book by Omar El-Kurd.
Yes.
And so that also came out recently, which is why this is the only reason why I think of it as connected.
Yeah.
And so I would love to read that as well, but I didn't include it in my homework initially because it's connected, but it's connected just because they have similar release dates.
Yeah.
I think they both came out in February or March of this year. So
it's okay.
Yeah.
I love it.
But another good one to maybe get into. So.
Absolutely. Add it to the list.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for this week's conversation about Perfect Victims and what an amazing book it is. Please go read it. And Damien, you're up next time. What do you bring to the table in our next episode?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring a piece from the newest edition of Hammer and Hope to the table for us to talk about in our next episode. They recently released their 6th edition, which is very exciting, and we are huge fans of theirs, and I'm looking forward to reading all of it, obviously. But I'm going to start with this piece that I'm bringing to the table, which is called Donald Trump and the Far-Right Insurgency in Europe, which was written by Gary Young, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Manchester over in England. He's also an author. His most recent book is called Dispatches from the Diaspora, From Nelson Mandela to Black Lives Matter. But I'm really excited to check out this piece. It seems to be all about how the far right and more conservative parties have been able to rise to power throughout history in both the United States and around Europe. And the tagline of this piece is, quote, "On both sides of the Atlantic, a belligerent sense of whiteness and national identity, beset by economic insecurity, is winning elections." So I'm really looking forward to reading this piece and seeing what we can learn from it in our next episode, and obviously getting into the 6th edition of Hammer and Hope, which is really exciting.
It is exciting.
Yes.
I'm always glad to see them release a new issue.
Absolutely. I've been waiting for us to get to it. So here we are.
And Gary Young, I've read one of his books about Martin Luther King's The Speech on the National Mall called, I believe it's called The Speech.
Very good.
But he's a great author, great writer.
Awesome.
So looking forward to getting into that article and maybe reading that other book of his.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.